Wolf Rider, Part 3. Monday morning, Andy got a message reminding him that during 8th period, his normal study hall, Mrs. Baskin was expecting him. His first thought was that Nina had filed charges after all. Anticipating the worst, he went to her office. "Andy," she began in her soft voice, almost a whisper, "I spoke to Officer Dorfman. I don't know if he'll be getting in touch with you or your father, but as of this morning, that young woman had not filed formal charges. He doesn't think she will." Andy sat back and sighed. "But this isn't over yet," Mrs. Baskin was quick to say. "She can still bring charges, and from what I've been told, she will if—" She left the "if" to dangle. "If what?" "If you bother her in any way at all again." "I was never bothering her." Mrs. Baskin frowned. "Andy, I'm going to be very direct with you. By your own admission, you called her, a perfect stranger, twice, harassed her in the college library, persisted in harassing her at the college student building, even used force, but—" "Andy, I want you to listen to me." "But what about that guy?" Mrs. Baskin shook her head. "Andy, no more." Andy slumped down and stared at the ceiling. "Now," Mrs. Baskin continued, "I've done some checking. Your grades seem fine. You appear to have a good number of friends. I don't see any problems in school. How are things at home?" "Fine." Mrs. Baskin considered that for a moment. "Are you sure?" she probed. "Yes." Again she lapsed into thought. Then she said, "I'd still like you to come by on Mondays during study hall period for a brief chat these next few weeks." Andy continued to stare at the ceiling. "Andy," she said, "it would be much better if you talked about things. To bottle them up only hurts you." "What's the point?" he told her. "No one believes me." "I do." "About everything?" "Andy, you're being trusted. No one is punishing you. You're under no restraints. But let me remind you, as a friend, Andy, if anything else happens, you'll likely find yourself in serious trouble." "What if I could prove the thing about Zeke?" said Andy. "Don't," reassured Miss Baskin. As soon as Andy got home, he brought the phone into his room. On one side of it he placed his notebook in which he had written his questions, a fake survey for the town newspaper. On the other side he put the list of people he was going to call. With a deep breath he edged forward in his chair and called the first number. As it rang, he nervously wiped his free hand on his shirt to get rid of the sweat. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice. "Can I speak to Dr. Carlos Boros?" "Who's calling, please?" "Peter Smith," said Andy. "I'm taking a survey." "Just a moment, please. He's out back." The phone clattered down and Andy waited, growing increasingly tense. "Hello?" It was a new voice, a man's. "Is this Dr. Carlos Boros?" "Yes, it is." "This is Peter Smith, and I'm doing a survey from the Madison Times. Do you take it?" "Yes, I do." "I'd like to ask you what you think of it." "Well," said Dr. Boros, "it's all right, I suppose." Andy decided it was not Zeke he was hearing. Abruptly hung up. Only then did he realize he'd been holding his breath. "Hello?" A woman's voice. "Can I speak to Mr. Jack Irwin?" "Sorry, he's not in. Can I take a message?" "That's all right," said Andy. "I'll call back." It was close to 4:30 when he made his 15th call. "Hello?" "Can I speak to Dr. Philip Lucas?" "Speaking." Andy felt as if someone had slammed him in the stomach. It was Zeke's voice he was hearing. This is Peter Smith," he managed to say, his heart hammering. "Who did you say?" "Peter Smith?" "Yes, Mr. Smith. What can I do for you?" I'm doing a survey for the Madison Times. Do you take it?" Andy's voice kept breaking. "Yes." "Can I ask you what you think of it?" For a moment Dr. Lucas said nothing. "Sir?" said Andy, thinking he might have lost him. "Who is this?" asked Lucas. "Peter Smith," said Andy. Then he remembered with horror that it was the name he'd given when Zeke called. "Whom do you represent?" "The newspaper," Andy faltered. "I'm taking a survey and—" "I'm not interested in such things," said Lucas, and hung up. Stunned, Andy held the phone until it began to beep. Then he put it down and buried his head in his arms, attempting to recapture the voice he had just heard. Zeke's voice. Dr. Philip Lucas's voice. They were the same. Certain his father had mentioned Lucas, Andy struggled to recall something about the man. He came up with nothing. He wondered if he had ever seen him. No picture came to mind. And what if I'm wrong? He asked himself. Andy reached for the phone and began to punch in Lucas's number, only to drop the receiver quickly. He was trembling. He forced himself to check the next name on the list. Hurriedly, almost in a panic, he called, conscious of his desire that he wanted someone else, anyone, to sound like Zeke. But by the time he had made all the calls, only one fit: Dr. Philip Lucas. Andy was in the kitchen finishing a salad when Dr. Zadinsky came home. "How are you doing?" his father called from the door. "Fine," said Andy without turning around. He had been dreading the moment when he had to confront him with what he had learned. Just the thought of it made him feel ill. "Sorry I'm late," his father said. "How was your day?" "Nothing special," Andy replied. "Be right there. Just want to wash up." "Take your time." After a moment, Dr. Zadinsky called, "I heard from Mrs. Baskin this afternoon." He came into the kitchen and began to set the table. "She told me that the student hadn't pressed charges so far, and the police, according to her, aren't pushing her to do so either." Andy nodded. "So I called the lawyer's office to cancel my appointment. That should make you feel good." Andy, more and more upset, began to serve the dinner. His father looked at him, but said nothing. The food served, Andy sat opposite his father. "Andy," Dr. Zadinsky said finally, "look at me." Andy looked up, tears running down his face. "What's the matter?" "Zeke is real," Andy said, unable to keep it back. The words came out half choked. His father stared at him, then shook his head sadly. "What can I do to get you off this?" Andy gulped for breath. "All I'm saying is that someone should tell her she's going to get killed." "Andy," his father said, "give me one iota of objective proof. One." Andy, afraid to tell his father what he had found out, pushed himself away from the table and fled into his room. He lay on his bed, staring at nothing. Through the walls, he listened to his father's muffled, agitated voice on the phone to Peggy. After a moment, Andy crawled to the foot of his bed and eased the door open a crack. "Exactly," he heard his father say. "The kid is caught up in a fantasy." Andy shut the door and pressed his face into his pillow. "I wish," he cried to himself, "I wish I didn't know." In class the next day, Andy could hardly pay attention. Instead, he sat in the far back doodling in his notebook. Zeke, Nina, Lucas. The letters were elongated, twisted, endlessly linked to one another. Sometimes he inserted his own name. Vague notions of trying to warn Nina again kept edging into his mind, as did thoughts about asking his father about Lucas. Then Andy realized that before he said or did anything else, he had to be 100% certain he was right about Lucas. With that in mind, he headed for Brazel Hall at the college as soon as school let out. A note tacked to Dr. Zadinsky's door explained he was at a meeting. Relieved, Andy slipped past along the hall where, next to the departmental office, there was a wall chart on which all the professors' office numbers were listed. Dr. Lucas had room B316. The door to Lucas's office was locked. Andy made a fast check of the schedule posted on it and discovered he was teaching Math 520 in room M56. The first student he met told him where he could find the place. Minkoff Hall was a classroom building, its rooms arranged in sequence. The one Andy wanted was easy to locate. Through a door window he could see that a class was in session, and fortunately the entrance was at the back of the room. Wishing his heart would calm down, Andy put his hand on the door handle, rehearsing once more the story he'd concocted in case of a challenge. As he entered the class, everyone in the room, including Lucas, who was writing on the blackboard, turned. "Yes?" Lucas said, peering over a pair of glasses that slipped to the end of his nose. He tapped them back up. Andy said, "A friend of mine asked me, to take notes for him?" His voice quavered. "He's sick." Lucas considered Andy for a moment, then swung back to the board. As he continued to write and talk, the students shifted their attention back to him. Andy took the nearest seat. When Lucas finished writing and faced the class, Andy got his first really good look at him. Lucas was in his 50s, older than Andy's father. He was slimmer, too. His suit was brown, perfectly fitted. Andy decided his shirt was tinted gray. His tie was held in place with an elegant tie clasp, and when he lifted his arms, fancy cufflinks flashed. Dr. Lucas's face was as composed as his clothing, smooth-shaven, pink, with few lines. It reminded Andy of a baby's face. His thick, dark hair, combed back with a slight wave, was gray at the temples. When he talked to the class, he stood very still. His steady eyes, behind slightly tinted glasses, appeared completely earnest, focusing now on this student, now that. His voice was soft, low, persistent. Lucas didn't look at all as Andy had imagined him, just the opposite. In front of the room stood a calm, dignified man. What impressed Andy most was his command of the class. No one spoke out of turn. All Andy could hear, save for Lucas's voice, Zeke's voice, was the occasional creak of a shifting chair, the scratch of a pencil on paper. No bell sounded to end the class. Everyone seemed to know exactly when time was up. Lucas made his final remarks, something about the date of a future exam and homework to be done and collected. Then, hands clasped, he watched over the students as they made for the door. Andy scrambled up, but when he turned to take one last look, he discovered Lucas's was gazing right at him. "Young man," said Lucas, "would you please stay?" Taken by surprise, Andy stopped where he was, watching the other students leave. He felt like calling out for help, but in moments they were gone. "Now then," said Lucas calmly but firmly, "you said you came to take notes for a sick friend. What friend? You took no notes." "I think I made a mistake," Andy stammered out. "See, my friend was sick, and he asked me to sit in on his class. Only I think it's this one. Only I don't think it's this one. I didn't mean to bother you." Lucas kept his hands on Andy. Lucas kept his eyes on Andy. "Who was the instructor?" he asked. Andy felt himself getting red. "Do you know the name?" insisted Lucas. "Dr. Zadinsky," Andy got out. "Ah," said Lucas, "then you do indeed have the wrong class." He turned to the table where his papers were and began to gather them up. Andy wasn't sure what to do. Lucas looked at him over his shoulder. "You may go," he said. "What's the matter?" said Dr. Zadinsky when he realized Andy wasn't eating his dinner. "Dad," Andy began, looking down, what if I told you I know who Zeke is?" When his father said nothing, Andy peeked up. Dr. Zadinsky's face was flushed with anger. "How many times have you promised me that you'd drop this?" he said, speaking with great deliberation. "I know who he is," Andy whispered. Dr. Zadinsky thrust himself away from the table, got up, and walked into the living room, his hands deep in his pockets. Andy watched anxiously. "I don't want to hear," his father said. Andy felt sick. "I mean," his father continued, "I don't know what you've done now. Frankly, I'm afraid to ask. All I do know is that again and again you've promised." He stopped what he was about to say, shook his head, and dropped onto the living room couch. Andy watched from the table. "Please come here," his father said. Feeling like a little boy about to be punished, Andy reluctantly did as he was told. His father gestured him to a chair. "Sit down," he said. Andy sat. Dr. Zadinsky stared at him. Then he said, "Did you or did you not promise to lay off?" "Yes, but—" "Yes or no?" "Sort of." His father leaned forward out of the couch. How are we going to trust each other if you keep making promises, then keep breaking them?" "I had to find out, Dad. I had to." "When you've been warned, told, even threatened?" "The other day," said Andy, "when we were biking, she was there, alone. She could have been killed." Dr. Zadinsky's eyes got very big. "Who are you talking about?" "Nina." His father said nothing. He just looked at Andy. "Don't you care?" Andy asked. Dr. Zadinsky folded his arms over his chest and sat back. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not the slightest bit interested." "Not interested?" Andy echoed. "Andy, let's get this straight. I believe someone called you that Friday. I believe there's a young woman named Nina Clemmer who is a student at my college. But it was a crank call. Okay? An obscene call. But it's not to be taken seriously. You've become obsessed. Absolutely obsessed. It has got to stop. It's impossible to believe anything you say anymore. This girl,